Hey folks, in this episode I'm going to show you how to make this particle system in geometry nodes. The good thing about this particle system is you can loop it on any frame and you can adjust the speed to your choice. It's quite an advanced tutorial. I'll walk you through it step by step. So without further ado, let's get to it. Open up Blender. We're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons we're going to search for Node and then enable the Node Wrangler here. When you've done that, click this button and click Save Preferences, and that will ensure the Node Wrangler loads every time you load Blender. We'll just close this window. I'm going to go over to my render settings over here. I'm going to enable ray tracing, so I'm on EV by the way. I'll then go to my output tab over here. I'm going to enable render region. I'm going to change my frame rate to 30 FPS. I'll then go back to my render settings over here. I'm in my layout view, which is this tab up here, so you should have a clean window. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll then change this window from the 3D viewport to the timeline. I'll just hit N to hide the end panel, and I'm going to set my end frame to 240. I'll then hit enter. I'll just make this window a bit smaller. I'll then take my cursor to the bottom left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'll left click and drag up and open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to Geometry Node Editor. I'll then hit N to hide the end panel. I'm going to select the default cube, and in the Geometry Node window, I'm going to click New, and that will add a new node tree. Maybe I can make this window a bit bigger. I'll take the group input. I'm going to hit Delete. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for icosphere, and I'll add this here. I'm going to change the subdivisions to 3, and maybe I'll set a radius of 2. Connect the mesh socket to the geometry group output in my 3D viewport. I'll hit numpad 1 to go into front view. There are several ways of adding particles in geometry nodes. We can distribute points on the faces, but for this tutorial we're going to be distributing the points in a volume, and to do that we need to convert this to a volume object. Shift A, and I'm going to search for mesh to volume, and I'll pop that in between the icosphere and the group output. I'm going to change the density to, let's say, 24. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for distribute points in volume, and I'll pop that in between there. I'm going to change my density to, let's say, 250. This amount of points can make Blender lag a bit, especially a bit later on down the line. The viewport's really going to struggle, so I'm just going to create a little viewport performance boost, and to achieve that I'm just going to take this distribute points in volume node. I'm going to hit Control Shift D, and that will duplicate the node while maintaining the connection to the previous node. And this one, I'm going to set this to 5. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for switch, and we'll choose switch, and I'll pop that in between the distribute points in volume and the group output node. I'll then plug this distribute points in volume with the lower density into the bottom socket. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for is, and we'll choose is viewport, and I'll pop that here. I'll then plug the is viewport socket into the switch socket of the switch node. So essentially what this setup does is the viewport will display this node here with the density of whatever you put in here. So I'm going to put in 1 for example, and when we hit render it's going to render out this distribute points in volume with a higher density. So this setup just makes the viewport a bit more responsive. Okay, moving forward. So I'm just going to grab the group output and put it over here. Shift A, and I'm going to search for repeat, and we'll select the repeat zone and we'll pop it here. I'll then plug the output from the switch node into the geometry socket of this first repeat node. I'll then plug this socket into the geometry socket of the group output. So now we need to displace these particles. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for set position, and we'll add a set position node, and I'll pop that in the repeat zone in between these two repeat nodes. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for noise texture, and I'll grab a noise texture and I'll pop it down here. Maybe I'll just increase this window, give us a bit more space. I'm going to disable normalize. I'll then enable 4D, and I'll plug the color from the noise texture into the offset of the set position node. I'll then hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for vector, and we'll choose vector math, and I'll pop that in between there. We're going to change it from add to scale, and I'll keep the scale set at 1 for now. We'll then go to this noise texture over here. I'm going to take the detail all the way to 0, the roughness to 0, and I'm going to change the scale to, let's say, 0.5. That should do for now. I'll then go up to my repeat zone over here, and I'm going to increase the iterations to, let's say, 12. For my final, I might adjust this to anything between 12 and 24. Fewer iterations results in better viewport performance. Higher iterations results in lower viewport performance. So just keep that in mind. So if your computer's lagging while making this, you can either decrease your iterations or you can decrease the density of this distribute points in volume. So next up, I want to be able to change the size of the points. So I'm just going to bring this window down a bit. I'm going to zoom in. All these points are currently the same size. I want some variation in the scale of the points. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to search for set, and we'll choose set point radius. And I'll pop that in between the switch node and the repeat zone. I'll just take these two nodes here. I'm going to hit G, just going to bring them out of the way just for the minute. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random and we'll choose random value and I'll pop that down here. For the minimum, I'm going to set to 0.015 and for the maximum, I'm going to set to 0.05. I'll then plug the value into the radius socket of the set point radius. Excellent. So we're going to animate these particles using this W factor on the noise texture node. But of course, I want the noise texture to loop, and we can't just loop it by adding keyframes here. So I'm going to create a system where this loops automatically. I've actually covered this before in more detail in previous tutorials. Just follow along and it should all make sense. I'll just increase this window. So isolate your noise texture and this scale node. In fact, I'm going to take this noise texture and I'm going to bring it across over to here. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for mix color and we'll choose mix color and I'll pop that in between there. I'll then take this noise texture node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop it down here and I'll plug this into the bottom socket of the mix color node. Maybe I'll just bring this down over to here. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for math and we'll choose math and I'll pop this over here. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop this over here. I'm going to change this one from add to multiply. I'll then box select both of these nodes. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'm just going to drag them down to round about here. I'll take this node, I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop that over here. I'm going to change this from multiply to subtract. I'll then hit Shift D to duplicate and I'm going to pop this over here. We'll change this one from subtract to floored modulo. I'll then hit Shift D and duplicate and pop it down here. I'll then change this from floored modulo to divide. Move across over to here. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for scene and we'll choose scene time. I'm going to plug this multiply node into the W factor of this noise texture. I'll plug this multiply node into the W factor of this noise texture. I'll then plug this subtract node into the top socket of this multiply node. I'll then take this scene time node and plug the frame socket into the top socket of the floored modulo. I'll plug the floored modulo into the top socket of this multiply node. I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag, and that will add a control point. I'll then connect this control point to the top socket of this subtract node. We just need one more node here. So I'm going to take this add node. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate and I'll pop it down here. I'll change this from add to divide. I'll then connect this divide node into the factor of the mix color node. I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag to add another control point here. I'll just hit G, I'll just bring this down. I'll then connect this control point into the top socket of this divide node. Maybe I'll hold down Shift, right click and drag. I'll then hit G just to bring this across over to here. So essentially this node and this node are all connected to this floored modulo. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for value and we'll add a value node. With the value node selected, I'm going to hit F2 and I'll rename this to loop frame. I'll then connect this socket to the bottom socket of the floored modulo. I'll then connect it to the bottom socket of the subtract node. Finally, I'll connect it to the bottom socket of this divide node over here. I'll just bring this out over to here. I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag just to create a control point. I'll hit G, just bring it across over to there perhaps. I'll then hold down Shift, right click and drag, add another control point. I'll hit G, just bring this up to round about there. Hold down Shift, right click and drag, hit G. And this is just so we can see where everything's going. We'll neaten this up in a bit. So next up we need to connect this divide node into the loop. So I'm going to take this value and I'm going to plug it into the bottom socket of this multiply node. I'll then connect this socket to the bottom socket of this multiply node. Let's just neaten this up before we continue because it's going to look a mess otherwise. So I'm going to box select that control point and the floored modulo. I'm just going to hit G. Just going to bring this up to round about there. I'll then box select all of these control points here. I'm going to hit SX0. I'll select this control point. I'm going to hit G, Y, just bring this up. I'll select this one, G, Y, just going to bring this down slightly. I'll box select this one. I'm going to hit G, Y, just bring this up slightly. Maybe I can box select these control points. I'm going to hit SX0. I'll then box select these. I'm going to hit G, Y, just bring these down to round about there. Okay, it's looking a bit neater now. Excellent. Maybe I can select this floored modulo. I'm going to hit G, just bring this back. So with the outputs of this divide node, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and drag just to add a control point. Hold down Shift, right click and drag, add another control point. I'll hit G, just bring this across over to here. Hold down Shift, right click and drag, G. I'll then box select all of these control points. I'm going to hit SX0 and maybe I'll select this multiply node. I'm going to hit G, just bring this down to round about there. Okay, so we need one more value node. So I'm just going to take this value node here. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate. I'm going to hit F2 and we'll rename this to speed. I'll then connect this socket to the top socket of this divide node. I'm going to set this bottom value to 100. So my timeline's got 240 frames here. So I'm going to set this to 240 and I'll adjust the speed to, let's say, 1 for now. I'll just quickly explain how this works. So this loop frame is going to be the frame in which the texture loops. So I've got my end frame set to frame 240, but we could also change this to any number we like. So for example, if I quickly just disconnect this noodle here, so if I was to set this to 240, that would be obviously representative of this loop frame node here. But we can set it to anything, so I could set it to 30, just for example. And what that means is going to be driven by the frame scene time. So it's going to play for 30 frames on your timeline. This value will change from 0 to 30. And when you get to frame 31, this value will reset back to 0 and it will continue to count to frame 60. So from 31 to 60, it will count from 0 to 30. And then when it reaches frame 61, this will reset to 0 and then it will start the counting process back to 0 to 30 again. So it's basically counting from 0 to 30 every 30 frames. We then take that floored modulo repeated sequence and we multiply it, but multiplying it will make it too fast. So we then have to divide it by a number. We can divide it by a value of which we set here, which will be the speed. So that's how this top row will work. So that's this top section, which is explained. But with this bottom section down here, we're basically going to be doing exactly the same, but we're going to be subtracting the value. So that means that instead of counting from 0 to 30, 0 to 30, it's going to be counting from 30 to 0, 30 to 0, which will drive this W factor on this noise texture. So the W factor on this one is playing forward from 0 to 30, and this one is playing back from 30 to 0. But of course, I don't want it to loop on frame 30, so I'm just going to connect this noodle here, and then we can change whatever loop frame we want. I'm going to set mine to 240 because I've got 240 frames in my timeline. Essentially, the W factors of these two noise textures, which are driven by the floored modulo, the speed and this subtract node system, are going to be mixed together and divided by the loop frame and the floored modulo values. And we can determine the floored modulo value by the loop frame. I hope that made sense. Moving on, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for value and I'm going to choose value. And I pop that down here. So the value of these two noise textures have to be identical at all times, otherwise the illusion is lost. So I'm going to connect this value node into the scale of this noise texture. I'll also connect it into the scale of this noise texture. I'll hit F2 and I'm going to rename it to noise scale. And I'll set a value of, let's say, 0.5. That will do for now. I'll just increase my 3D viewport just for the minute. So let me just skip back to frame 1. In fact, I'm going to skip close to the end. So I'm going to go to frame 200. I'll then hit play and you see as it restarts it should loop seamlessly. And for example, if I was to set the loop frame to, let's say, 30, it's going to repeat every 30 frames. So it's just creating this repeating pattern. But I'm going to set mine to frame 240. And the speed, I'll set this to 2. You can kind of see what's happening. Maybe we can set it to 5. You can change it to whatever you like. I'm happy with a value of 1 for now. I'll just skip back to frame 1. So you're probably wondering what these add nodes are for. And this is so we can change the seed value. So if we're not happy with the noise pattern, we can change the noise pattern on the fly. So I'm just going to pop this add node in between this multiply node and the W factor. And I'll do the same for this one. I'll then hit Shift A. I'm going to search for value and we'll add another value node, F2, and I'm going to rename it to seed. I'll then connect this seed socket into the bottom socket of this add node, and I'll also connect it into the bottom socket of this add node. To use this seed value correctly, it's best to give it whole round numbers, so for example 2. So I'll just reset this back to 1. I'm going to box select all of these nodes here and the control points. I'll then hit F and that will add a frame, and I'll rename the label to noise loop system, which is up here. I'll just drag this down. So I think now it's a good time to add the materials. I'm going to take my cursor to the top left of the 3D viewport until I see a crosshair. I'm going to left click and drag across and open up a new window. I'll then change this from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. I'll just hit N to hide the N panel. This is from my last tutorial. You won't have this node unless you followed it. Basically a node group of real world metal colors. So I'll just hit delete. I'll get rid of that. If you haven't got material, just click new. And I'm going to rename this material to particles. I'll then take my cursor in my geometry node window. And after the repeat zone, I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for set, and we'll choose set material, and I'll pop that in there. I'll then choose that particles material. Before we move on, it's a good idea to save your project. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save my project as like and subscribe. Thanks folks, you absolute legends. And then click Save As. So with this material, I want to capture a couple of attributes to help colorize the material on the particles. The material is going to have two elements. So the first element is going to be a color gradient, and the second element of the material is I want to isolate random points so we can give an emissive value to them. So for the color gradient, I want this to be based on the proximity of another object. So in my 3D viewport, I'm just going to hit Shift C just to ensure that my cursor is centered to the world. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to add mesh, and we'll choose icosphere. I'll then expand the icosphere options in the bottom left, and I'm going to increase the subdivisions to 4. I'll just collapse those options. I'm going to right click and choose Shade Smooth. I'll navigate to my outliner. I'm going to click this icon and I'll enable all these filters here. With the icosphere selected in your outliner, I'm going to double click the name and I'm going to rename it to Proximity. I'll then select the cube object, which is the particle system. In fact, I'm just going to rename this to Particles GN for Particles Geometry Nodes. I'll then increase my geometry node window. I'll then drag this proximity object into the geometry node editor. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for mesh line. I'll add a mesh line here. I'll set the count to 1. I'll hit Shift A and I'm going to search for geometry proximity, and I'll pop that there. We're going to change it from faces to points. I'll then connect the object info location into the start location of the mesh line. I'll then plug the mesh socket from the mesh line into the geometry socket of the geometry proximity. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for map, and we'll choose map range, and I'll pop that there. I'll then plug this distance value into the top socket of the map range node. I'll just drag my map range node across over to here. Maybe I can take this vector scale node down here. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random, and we'll choose random value node. For the min, I'm going to set to 0.01, and for the max, I'm going to set to 50. I'm going to plug the value from the random value node into the toMin socket of the map range node, and on the from max, I'm going to set this to 1.5. That should do for now. We might need to adjust that in a minute. So from here, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for store, and we'll choose store named attribute, and I'll pop that in between the set point radius and the repeat zone. And for the name, I'm going to rename this to prox for proximity, and the attribute we're going to capture will be the proximity to that icosphere object. I'll then navigate to my outliner, and I'm going to hide the proximity object from the viewport and from render. I'll just ensure that I've got my particles GN selected. Maybe I can neaten this up a little bit, so I'm just going to drag this up to here. I'll drag this up to here, just drag these across. So now, where we've got this proximity attribute, we can call that up in the shader editor. So in my shader editor, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for attribute, and we'll add the attribute there. I can then call that attribute up by typing in prox, or you can simply hit Control C to copy this value and then Control V to paste it in there. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for color ramp, and we'll choose color ramp, and I'll pop that in between there. For this first color, I'm going to set this to blue, and for this second color, I'm going to set this to pink. Something around there. I'll then connect the factor from the attribute node into the factor of the color ramp, and the color from the color ramp into the base color of the principal BSDF. Maybe I can just drag this flag across. Let's say 0.5. I'm going to go to my outliner. I'm going to select my default lamp. I'm going to hit delete. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to add light, and I'm going to choose sun. I'll navigate to my sun tab down here, and I'm going to give a strength of 10. That should do for now. I'll then navigate to my world tab over here and set this to 0. I'm just going to go into rendered view quick. Maybe I can disable my overlays. I'll select my particles. Okay, it's not coming through. Let me just check. Okay, on this map range, we're going to set the toMax to 0. There we go. Excellent. It's coming through. I'm going to navigate to my outliner. I'll select my sun lamp. I'm going to go to my sun settings over here, and I'm going to increase the angle to 45 degrees. I'll select my particle system. I'll then navigate to my shader editor, and on my principal BSDF, I'm going to increase the roughness to 1. So next up, I want to isolate random particles to give them an emissive value. So I'm going to take this store named attribute node. I'm going to hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll pop it between this store named attribute and the repeat zone. I'm going to change the name to RNDM for random. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for random, and we'll choose random value. we're going to keep the defaults with minimum set to 0 and maximum set to 1. And I'll plug that value into the value of this store named attribute node. I'll then navigate to my shader editor. I'm going to hit Shift A and I'm going to search for attribute, and we'll add another attribute node. And the name would be RNDM. I'll then hit Shift A and I'm going to search for color, and we'll choose color ramp. And I'll pop that there. I'll change the interpolation type from linear to constant. I'll select this white flag and I'm going to change the position to 0.995. I'll then plug the factor from this attribute node into the factor of the color ramp. I'll then plug the color from the color ramp into the strength of the emission on my principal BSDF. I want to be able to change the strength of the emission, so I'm going to hit Shift A and search for math, and we choose math node, and I pop that in between the color ramp and the principal BSDF. We'll change it from add to multiply, and I'm going to give a value of, let's say, 25. Now we just need to add a bit of color to these emissive particles, so I'm going to take this color ramp, I'm going to hit Ctrl Shift D, and that will duplicate the node whilst maintaining a connection to the previous node, and I'll just pop that down here. So for this first flag, I'm going to set this to blue, and for this second flag, I'm going to set this to orange. I'm going to change the position of this orange flag to 0.997. So in my geometry node editor, I'm going to hit Control Space, and that will go into full screen view. So your geometry node tree should look something like that. I'll just hit Control Space to exit out of full screen view. I'm going to go over to my render tab over here. I've enabled ray tracing, and I'm going to enable motion blur. I'll expand motion blur options down here, and where I've got my frame rate set to 30 frames per second, we're going to need a shutter speed of 0.6. I'm going to increase my steps to, let's say, 6. Increasing the render steps on your motion blur will increase your render time, but it's worth it for the end result. We should move on to the camera settings, so I'm going to enable my overlays over here. I'm going to go to viewport shading. In my 3D viewport, I'm going to hit numpad 1 to go into front view, numpad period, and that will center my camera to the selected object. I'll then hit Control Alt numpad 0, and that will align my camera to the 3D viewport. I'll then select my camera. I'm going to go to my object data over here, and for the X location, I'm going to type in 0. For the Y location, I'm going to type in -16, and for the Z location, I'm going to type in 0. I'll then orbit round in my 3D viewport. I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to go to empty, and I'm going to choose sphere. I'll then navigate to the empty data over here. I'm going to increase the size to, let's say, 4. I'll then select my camera. I'm going to hold down Shift and left click select the empty object. I'm going to hit Control P, and we'll set the parent to object keep transform. I'm going to skip back to frame 1, and with the sphere empty object selected, I'm going to go to my object data tab over here, and for the Z rotation set to 0 degrees, I'm going to add a keyframe. I'll then navigate to my timeline. I'm going to skip to the last frame. I'm going to skip one more frame, so we're on frame 241. And for the Z rotation, I'm going to type in 360, hit enter, and then add another keyframe there. I'll then take my cursor to the timeline. I'm going to hit A to select all the keyframes. I'll then hit T, and I'm going to change the keyframe animation interpolation type from Bezier to linear. I'll now hit numpad 0. I'm going to select my camera, and now if I hit play, you should see that the camera is orbiting around your particles. Excellent. I'll then navigate to my compositing tab over here. I'm going to enable use nodes. I'll then navigate to this view tab over here. Just ensure that you've got backdrop enabled. I'm going to decrease my timeline to give us a bit more room. I'll then click fit. I'll then hit N to hide the end panel. I'll just drag this render layers across. I'll hit Shift A. I'm going to go to filter, and I'm going to choose glare, and I'll pop that in between there. I'm going to change it from streaks to bloom. Decrease the size to, let's say, 0.1, maybe 0.05. I'll also decrease the strength to 0.1. The color isn't really coming through on these emissive materials, so I'm just going to go back to my layout view over here. I'm going to go into rendered view. I'm going to select my particles. I'll just increase my shader editor window. I haven't connected my color ramp to the color socket on the principal BSDF. I'll just hit F12 just to render out a preview. Okay, the color's coming through a bit better. Maybe I can decrease the strength a bit on the emission just so the saturation bumps up a little bit more. So I'm going to close this window, and in my shader editor, I'm going to change this value on the multiply node to, let's say, 10. I'll just hit F12 to render out a preview. Okay, that's looking a lot better. Maybe I can decrease the brightness on my sun lamp as well. It's a bit bright, so I'm going to hit escape. I'll navigate to my outliner. I'm going to select my sun lamp. I'm going to go to my lamp data over here, and I'm going to reduce the strength to, let's say, 7.5. I'll then navigate to my render tab over here. I'll select my particle system. I'll then hit F12 just to render out a test frame. Okay, it's not looking too shabby. I'm not really happy with the focal length because there's quite a bit of compression on this. I want a bit more perspective in my render, so I'm going to hit escape. I'll then select my camera. I'm going to go to my camera data tab over here. I'm going to reduce the focal length to, let's say, 24mm. I'll then go to the Object Data tab over here. I'll then decrease the Y location to, let's say, around -10 meters. I'm just going to hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, that's looking a bit better. I'll probably render the final in cycles. In Eevee, these points are rendered out as smooth cubes, whereas cycles will render these out as smooth spheres. And the last difference will be these emissive particles. So in Eevee, the emission won't affect the surrounding geometry, whereas in cycles, these emissive particles will help light up the surrounding particles. So if I just change this to slot 2, I'll then close this window. I'm going to go to my render tab over here. I'm going to change it from Eevee to cycles. I'm going to change the device type to GPU. I'm going to keep the noise threshold set to 0.01, and I'm going to change the max samples just for a test frame to 1024. I'll expand these lights options down here. I'm going to disable light tree. I'll then expand light paths, and I'm going to disable reflective and refractive caustics. I'm just going to hit F12 just to render out a preview. Okay, so that's the cycles render. You can see that they're smooth spheres. The emission values aren't set high enough to affect the surrounding geometry really. So maybe I'll have to bump up the emission values in cycles. And then if I go to slot 1, which is the Eevee render, you can see what's happening there. Also in Eevee, you can see that the orange particles are showing up a bit more, whereas in cycles, it's a bit different. So we may have to close this window here. We'll select our particle system. I'll just disable the overlays. I'm going to go into rendered view. So we may have to adjust the value on this color ramp here. So I'm going to take the orange flag and I'm going to set it to 0.998. I'll just decrease my max samples for cycles to 128 just for a test frame. I'll then hit F12. Okay, they're still not coming through, so I'll just escape that window. So we're going to navigate over to this color ramp here, and I'll decrease the position of the orange flag to 0.996. And maybe I'll take this top flag up here to 0.994. I'll then navigate to my render tab over here, and temporarily I'm going to decrease my samples to 128. I'll then navigate to this orange flag, and I'm going to increase the position to 0.997. I'll hit F12 to render out a test frame. Okay, that still isn't right, so I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to select my particle system. I'm going to increase my geometry node window. I'm going to zoom in, and for this distribute points in volume, I'm going to increase the density to, let's say, 10 just for now, just so I can see what's happening in the 3D viewport. Maybe I can change the position to this white flag to 0.990. Just going to zoom in over to here, and I'll set this orange flag to 0.995. I'm just looking around the 3D viewport because I want a mix of orange and blue. There's still too much orange. There are a few blue showing up, so I'm going to set this to 0.996. I'll then hit F12 just to render out a test frame. Okay, I'm happy with that result. It's a bit finicky, so you're just going to have to keep manipulating those color ramps until you've got something that you like. I'm then going to change this from slot 2 to slot 1 because I want all my renders to appear on slot 1. I'll then close this window. I'm going to change my distribute points in volume back to 1 for the viewport, and the render is going to be kept at 250 or higher. Maybe I'll bump that up to 500. So from here, your main controllers are going to be your noise scale, your seed pattern, the speed of the animation, and the frame where you want your animation to loop on. So adjust these values to your personal preference. These values here are a good starting reference point, and also up here in your repeat zone you can change the iterations. And for the final render, on my render settings, I'm going to keep a noise threshold of 0.01. I'm going to increase the samples to 1024. I'll also go to my output settings over here. Click this folder and choose a file location where you want to save your image sequence, then click accept. Choose a file format. If you go with PNG, go for RGB with a color depth of 16-bit. I'm going to choose a file format of OpenEXR with a codec of DWAA lossy, and that will decrease my file size whilst increasing dynamic range for post-production. I'm going to then go to my render tab over here. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. I'm going to expand the color management. I've got my view transform set to AGX because that's the current workflow I go with. And then it's simply a case of hitting Control F12 and that will render out your image sequence. Join me on Patreon as a free member and you'll have access to this file alongside other Blender files from previous tutorials. That's the tutorial in a nutshell. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please click like and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Have a great day. Level up, and thanks for watching.